have an outstanding panel of experts joining us here today. I'd like everyone to warmly welcome via your computers Chris Mattman. He is the inaugural Chief Data and Artificial Intelligence Officer at UCLA. We also have Zainab Shakur. She is the UC Davis Senior Campus Counsel and Privacy Officer. Zainab also co-chairs the UC AI Council Subcommittee on Transparency. We've got Al Lavasani. He is our system-wide Chief Privacy Officer. And finally, Shay Loven, UCSB's Chief Technology Officer. Thank you all for being here with us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through some of these concepts. So let's go ahead very quickly because we have a lot to cover here today. I'm going to walk you through a roadmap for today's session. Our goal today is to explore how to responsibly and safely manage data within AI tools and applications. To make the most of our time together and to meet the goals and objectives that you see ahead before you on the screen here today, we're going to begin with a quick level set, which will be a series of interactive polls that will gauge where everyone in the audience is starting from in terms of familiarity, experience, and concerns around AI data handling. Following that, we'll have a brief primer to establish some shared language and understanding around the concepts of P levels, which are essential to understanding data classification in AI systems here at the UC. That primer will be delivered to you today by Chris Mattman, so thank you, Chris. From there, we are going to launch into a moderated panel discussion, which should last about 20 to 25 minutes, where our panelists will be diving into real-world concerns, challenges, and strategies for the safe handling of data. And then we're going to wrap up with approximately 20 to 25 minutes of audience Q&A. We wanted to make sure that we gave you the time to interact with our panelists and glean as much knowledge from them with regards to your specific questions as possible. So with that, I know that seems like a lot. We'll get started with our level set. In order to do this, we're going to be using Slido for our interactive polling. If you haven't already, please take a moment to access Slido by going to slido.com and entering in the event code that you see on the screen, which is 1621914. Or you can simply scan the QR code if that is easier. Once you're in, you'll be able to respond to all 4 polls that we're about to launch. So let's go ahead and kick it off. I see some of you have already started. How often do you use AI tools in your day-to-day work? Okay, let's give it another couple seconds here. We've got a couple nevers, but it's looking like a lot of you are using AI tools daily. I'm guessing we're using things like ChatGPT, Copilot, maybe some of the AI features in your Zoom. Daily and weekly seem to be our biggest numbers here, but we do have some that are not using it. So let's see if we can figure out why that might be as we continue on with this. Let's go on to the next poll. How comfortable are you with analyzing the risks associated with using AI tools and systems? All right. Wow, it was big amount right at the beginning, and it's dropped back. So it sounds like we have kind of moderate comfort at analyzing the risks of using AI. Let that go for just another minute. By the way, I do note that we have somebody with a question in Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions in Q&A. We will try to address them as we move through the panel discussion, but we'll also utilize that Q&A function at the end. Finally, well, not finally, we have 2 more. So do you know how to classify your data using UC's P levels? Okay, let's see. What are P levels? That's good. We are going to be going over that, so that's great. We definitely wanted to take a minute to understand where everyone was at. Okay, but many of you are comfortable with P levels, so that's great. So the primer might not be for you, but it will be for everyone who's not as comfortable with it or not familiar with that term. Okay, I think we've got to the end. A couple more in now. Okay, and lastly, what is your biggest concern about using AI? And this one's going to be a word cloud, so feel free to just say in a word or two what your biggest concern might be. Privacy. Yeah, absolutely. Privacy, big. Accuracy, also a good concern. Data security, the environment. Reliability of content. We've got a lot of privacy here. Misinformation. Getting in trouble with the boss. That's an interesting one. Lack of critical thinking. I cannot do that, Dave. That's an interesting one. We'll have to dive into that later. All right. It's looking a lot like data security and privacy are some of our bigger concerns. Certainly, there are other items here: securing UC data, transparency. So we're not going to get into all of these today, but we will certainly be addressing security, privacy, data security, that kind of thing. That all goes to the heart of safe handling of AI. So thank you so much. I appreciate you all taking a few minutes to kind of level set with us. This helps us understand how to adjust our answers accordingly. And with that, let's go ahead and jump straight into our primer. Chris, would you like to walk us through the P levels?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jenny. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel here with everybody. And thank you so much to the now 200, almost 250 attendees that are part of the webinar. So really great to have you here learning about AI with us. Look, when we were preparing for this panel, and kind of, I want to shout out, to Jenny and Andrew and the team for organizing this select group. When we were preparing over many meetings, it kind of became quickly apparent, well, we weren't all talking about the same thing when talking about how to put data into these tools. And really let's be clear. And I saw one of the questions in the chat right now was, what are we talking about when we're talking about AI? And that's a great question. I think we're really talking about large language models today because most of the just lexicon of people, talking about AI really are talking about the way to interact with large language models. I do recognize, and we're not going to go into detail on this webinar about it. I do recognize there are other forms of AI. There's convolutional neural networks to see things. There's long short-term memory and recurrent neural networks to hear things. There's lots of different AI models. There's explainable AI. There's non-explainable AI. We're really talking about large language models, and we're really talking about tools, the primary set of which people are procuring nowadays that have these capabilities. So we're talking about purchase tools. There is custom development that happens, but in those purchase tools, given that a lot of times these are companies that various UCs are partnering with and working with, the issue becomes what type of data are you putting into these AI tools when you're chatting with them, when you're building new models, like, if you're using technologies like ChatGPT and you're building custom GPTs, what types of data are you putting into that? So as it turns out, the University of California system has a framework for categorizing and classifying the types of data that you put into not just AI tools, but you put into any type of information technology or software system. And this is really important. These are akin almost to national security classification levels, which is what type of information, intellectual property, data, private data, and things are going in and out of these systems that companies are building and that we're leveraging to offer services and products to the UC community. So there are 4 levels in the UC system for these P levels. It starts with P1, which is sort of minimal risk, all the way up to P4, which, if it was national security, would be like top secret and very, very high risk of damage if this information sort of leaks out. And there are each one of these levels has various sort of increasing security controls and guidance and really just, I'd say, importance that people need to kind of pay attention to when they're dealing with this type of data. And this classification framework is really used to determine what types of safeguards, both from a compliance perspective, but even beyond compliance, like what types of safeguards should we take as developers when we're dealing with this type of data? Should it be encrypted by default? Should it be encrypted in transit? The data, is it data that needs to be de-identified? And we'll get into this. We'll unpack this during some of the panelist discussion later that Jenny will moderate. Can we go to the next slide, please? Just in terms of dealing with how do we use the different P levels and P1 through P4, The first step is to determine basically which level of data that you're dealing with. And the next slide that we have is going to show you the different P levels and a very simple explanation for each one of them. But the first step is to determine, what P level of data that you're dealing with and what's the potential impact, of any unauthorized disclosure or modification of that information if it gets out. If it gets out through one of these AI tools that we're using or pieces of information technology that resides at these companies. So the P levels also tell us how to work and partner with our cybersecurity organizations, our compliance, legal, and other parts of the system in terms of applying the right security controls. And there are a set of UC policies that are associated with that. And of course, P1 has less controls and things like that because it has lower risk of it getting out and those things. And P4 has the highest amount. All of the different UC system campuses are beginning to implement the notion of these unit information security leads or USILs. And these are in the distributed units, basically the people that are partnering with the cyber and the CISO organization. They're really the subject matter experts in those departments for understanding the information technology, the types of controls and elements that they have there, the application portfolio management, what they have related to that. And this is just good guidance overall in this last bullet. And, again, if we were all working in the national security apparatus, they would tell us too, is it's always a good practice to avoid over classification and just believing everything is P4. It feels like the easy button. It's, feel safe. It's the most protected. And, we have a lot of things that we have to do. But the challenge with that is that it could lead to unnecessary costs, in putting data that actually there's very low risk if it gets out because you can find it on a website or something like that. But we've implemented all these cyber controls and processes and policies and worries that are needless. And on the other end of the spectrum, underclassification, just believing everything is P1. I can put anything into the tool because really it doesn't matter. Oops, I put a social security number in there. That's bad, and things like that. And so obviously the result there would be inadequate protection and a high risk for damage, for information that we don't want to leave the system. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you, Jenny. And so then this is really kind of the quick primer in terms of the summary of the levels. And, this is something that the team put together. It's a simple name for each one of these levels. P1 is the public type of data. P2 is really data for internal use, at the particular organization or the UC or within the system. P3 is sensitive data. And P4 is restricted or highly confidential data. So just in terms of a quick summary of each one, P1 is like it sounds. It's data that's okay to share freely and openly. This is, this is why higher education exists, right? It's published research articles. It's ways to find what classroom the students need to go to or professors need to go to. Course catalogs. That's an example of P1. P2, it's not really for public release, but if it did get out into one of these tools, these AI, large language models or things like that, it's a low risk. It's not the end of the world. It's not something that we'd love, but it's a low risk. These are things like you see email addresses and, oh, why is that bad to get out? Well, have you ever heard of spam? Anyways, we'll just move on. But yes, those are things, we don't want to get out. Employee work schedules. Well, for just, con ops, we don't necessarily want those to get out or people to know where people are at all times. Internal meeting notes and so forth. That's P2. P3, here's where we start to get pretty sensitive. It could cause harm to individuals or the UC if exposed. This is things like student grades, evaluations of employees, and so on and so forth. In my prior organization, they just moved to not even writing those down, just keeping them verbal because they were very sensitive. And then, research data under embargo and things like that. These are sensitive things that could cause harm to individuals or the UC if exposed. And then finally, the most restricted and highly confidential data. This is data that's actually legally protected or sensitive. And if it gets out, let's just say it's bad and it needs to be strictly guarded. These are things like social security numbers, medical records, and credit card and bank information. So these are all and by the way, this isn't to say that if you're dealing with P4 data, don't use AI. You just need to have different controls, for AI in those. Like maybe you're working in the health system and whatever, you need to have a different type of contract for the AI tools that, assure that there's a BAA, that you can deal with PHI data, patient health information, or maybe you're working on a DoD or a defense project and you're dealing with some of these things. You can use AI in these environments, but it really just is a way to trade and understand between the controls that you're going to need to do and the policies and the processes and so on and so forth. So that is a first step. There's a handy link at the bottom to UC Berkeley's data classification guide and how do we mark things, because we won't get into it in this thing, but having these classifications are important, but what's even more important is using them and marking your data with them and understanding that. But we'll get into that later. You can check that guide out. And thank you, Jenny. And the mic's back to you for our moderated panel.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. Yeah. And I'll just make a note on the UC Berkeley data classification step-by-step guide. That's for some of the folks out there that are really they don't feel comfortable. They're not used to using these. This is Berkeley's way of classifying data. It is not necessarily the UC's way. I just want to make that little caveat, but it is a good way to sort of view how to think through using the P levels. And you'll want to work with your own local data leads and security folks to figure out how you specifically want to do it. But we wanted to link this here for those of you that aren't familiar, just so you can get a feel for like what that process might or should look like in general. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop share so that we can just have some time with the panelists here. Thank you all again for being here. And Chris, thank you for that very quick letting us know P levels, P1 through P4. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in the next few minutes. But before we start with P levels, I really just wanted to start with this kind of grounding ourselves in the most basic thing of all. What is it that actually happens to our data when we put it into an AI tool? So what does data handling mean in that context? Zinab, can you walk us through what the data lifecycle is when we're putting UC data into a tool, any tool in the world? What happens to that data?
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. So of course, I'm going to answer this from a non-technical perspective because I'm not a technician. But the general data flow is quite important for our understanding of what happens to the data that we put into these systems. So we can start by thinking of ourselves as the user. We have a task, we have an issue, we have something that we want AI to assist us with. And in order to do that, we need to provide it with some sort of information. So we either upload a document, we give it some sort of command and instruction, some details about the issue that we're dealing with. That data then becomes our input into the system. And then, that data launches into whatever process, whatever company, whatever tool you're using to process, which essentially means, especially in the data privacy world, processing data means any sort of action that is happening upon that data. So it could be access, use, disclosure, et cetera. And so that needs to happen in order for the AI tool to be useful and essentially do the thing that we want it to do. And I think there can often be this misconception that, we have this one-to-one relationship. So if I'm just sending it to, OpenAI or whoever, I'm just having that one-to-one interaction there. And when they say, the model is not being trained with your data, it's fine. They're not going to use it for training purposes, but they might use it for other things, right? Just training the model is not the only thing that companies like to use data for and like to sort of harvest information. And it's also important to note that those services aren't necessarily the only party that's involved. So there are these concepts of the processor and the subprocessor, and subprocessors can be multiple other touch points for that data. So I guess what I mean is, we may be sending data to company A, but they may be disclosing and transmitting that data to company B, C, and D to either store, to actually do the processing with their AI model and their large language tools. And so now we've actually got, 4+ more external parties that have the ability to access our input, our data, to produce that output, the thing that we get back from it. So, one of the ways to sort of contextualize that is, I highly recommend that we review the privacy policy of the tool that we're using. That is the way that they can share with us, what their data handling practices are, what type of information they're collecting, what they're using it for, what they may be disclosing it for, who their sub-processors are. So who else is involved in that interaction where you're sending the data and getting something out of it. And, that's going to vary from tool to tool. You might even see that one thing you're using doesn't really have much of a policy, and that can kind of tell you a little bit about their posture and their data handling practices and whether or not you want to use them. And another thing that can also affect this is whether or not there's a contract with that company, right? So maybe it's not a free tool, it's something we've contracted for, and we have different terms than something that they're projecting out for their public tools. So it's more of an enterprise version. So I'll stop there because I know, Jenny, that might help you with the next question here, but I think that's the data flow that we want to make sure we're all on the same page with.
No, thank you, Zainab. That's great. And yeah, you've set this up perfectly. So you talked about going to the privacy notice on a site. If you want to use a tool, those can be really complicated. I have read through many of them in my lifetime. Sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't. And understanding all the sub-processors, everything else. And then sometimes we have tools where we do have a contract. So this is the perfect segue for, we hear a lot about things like controlled versus uncontrolled environments. Shay, can you talk us through what the difference is in those two things, sort of demystify those concepts and why that's important to us when we think about safe handling of data?
Yeah, sure. So probably the simplest way to start with this is that if you're not paying for the service or the UC is not paying for the service, then you're not the customer, you're actually the product. And so, she was talking about going through and looking at the privacy policies. If you just go to the standard ChatGPT or the standard, Google search page for that matter, and you look at what the privacy policy is, at some point down near the bottom in very fine print, you're going to see something that says, we reserve the right to use anything that you give us for any purpose that we feel like whatsoever at any point in the future, and don't promise to ever delete it at any point ever. That's not great. That is sort of the ultimate of the uncontrolled space, and pretty much any free service that you go to is going to be in some level of uncontrolled space. Controlled is the inverse of that. So when we go through a procurement process with the University of California, we almost always end up negotiating a different set of contract terms. We end up paying money and to some degree to actually support those negotiations and ensure that that data is not being used for other commercial activities to develop the services in the future. But those terms include things like, we will delete your data after so much time, or we will make sure that, or we will not use it to train future models. There's also an additional class of controlled systems, which are things we run on campus and that don't talk to any outside agency. I run Ollama on my workstation, so that's an LLM that sits there and it doesn't talk to anything but my monitor and my keyboard, essentially. There are several campuses like UC San Diego and UC Irvine that have built very complex, very fully fledged LLM environments to support different kinds of campus utilization, whether you're talking about Triton GPT or Zot GPT or other systems that are being developed on other campuses. And then there are the places where UC has actually licensed specific things. So some campuses have licensed portions that have paid for ChatGPT or paid for Copilot for segments of population. Campuses that are Google Workspace subscribers that have actually paid for that, they have access to a licensed version of Gemini. Some campuses have licensed versions of Zoom and even like versions of Zoom that have a BAA writer agreement on them, which provides a different level of trust around the use of the AI capabilities of those services.
Great, thank you. Can you give an example of an uncontrolled environment that people maybe assume is secure?
There are lots of them, but the one that I think we've, as a system, have had the most problem with over time is actually Gmail. And if you want to talk about Gmail as an uncontrolled system, somebody goes and gets a personal Gmail account. There are no privacy protections on it. And those of us that have been on the IT side of campus operations for a long time, it is not unusual for us to have to reach out to Google and have search results taken out of the global index because somebody sent an email with sensitive information, say embargoed research information, that had an attachment on it or was pointed to a private URL that now is showing up in Google search terms. So that's, every campus has had to deal with dozens of these over the last 15 years. That can happen in the AI space as well, as pieces of information end up embedded in future versions of models.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Shay. I don't think I would have even thought of that one. That one that my personal emails could end up in a search term somewhere. I think it's really good for us to think about that in the context of every single day, the things that you're doing. What is this space? Is it safe? And what am I putting in there? So I appreciate that. You mentioned, the controlled and uncontrolled environment. A controlled environment, for our purposes, will often have a contract attached to it, or we'll call that an enterprise model often. Al, I'd like to ask you, you do a lot of work, you're our system-wide privacy officer. You do a lot of work analyzing the contracts that we enter to at a system-wide level, or for OP specifically for the Office of the President. Can you walk us through what are some of the considerations that you do when you're thinking about approving it, and how does that apply, or how does that help us think through, what is safe and not safe in our day-to-day use of AI applications?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Yeah, of course, contract is just one step in the overall workflow of onboarding a vendor. And procurement has a process in place when there are onboarding vendors. So reviews has to be taken place, and they engage different groups to do the review, such as security, privacy, legal, accessibility, etc. So it's like a typical, like in that process, I'm gonna focus a little bit more on the security and privacy, at least review, and on the which there is an overlap, of course, when it comes to data. So the security review will make sure that the vendor, in this case, which they're providing an AI solution, they have the internal controls in good shape. So they will look at all these controls. I would look also, me as a privacy officer, especially the controls related to data security and protection, like what's their internal control, like the encryption, what do they do on that, the access control levels, is it robust? Like we look at all of these things, like audit, do they do all of these, like would they provide any certification like SOC 2 and all stuff, which they explain all of these reports. But in terms of, in addition to the security, of course, privacy, we focus more on the data. We will ask like the data flow, and when processing a data from where it's like from the moment it's going, the whole trajectory, where it's going. So we want to look at things in addition to what Zainab mentioned about like from the privacy perspective, like we're asking not just like we don't want the data to be training their model, but also they are like how they are treating the data in terms of, are they sharing it with other third parties or fourth parties, or they are using it for whatever. So all of the usage of data, we want to look at that as well. The location of the data, we want it to be like in the US. So all these obligations, we're going to be putting in them in the contract itself and put those mandates. So all of these are related to the vendor. But when it comes to AI tools, some of the risks comes not just from the vendor, but also internally. The business unit that requested that tool, we want to look also at the risks that are related to AI and data and how it's using. So we would ask about, provide us use cases. Like what are the use cases what are you using it for exactly? Who will be using it? The intention of the use, like all of these are very important for us to determine the risk related to AI from the internal perspective. So this is like on a high level, but hopefully I answered the questions.
Yeah, no, that's great, Al. Thank you so much. And I think it's important to note, you talked about that, you're considering all of the data flow that Anab talked about at the beginning of how is this data actually moving, but also what is the risk associated with the person who's got the data? What is the data that they have? So I think the takeaway there is it's great that we have these controlled environments, but we still have to think about how to handle things safely even within the controlled environment. But then also even more so when we think about handling data in an uncontrolled environment. So let's say I want to use an AI tool. And Chris, I'm going to ask this one from you. Let's say I want to use an AI tool in any of these. It could be controlled or uncontrolled. And I'm using really, really sensitive data. Like just from the get-go, what's my toolkit? What are some things I should be thinking about besides just P levels? Who can I talk to? What are my steps?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. This is an interesting question. This sort of runs the gamut from the space of de-identification of data, minimizing or aggregating or imputing data, and just changing it. And there's different approaches that you can take. I mean, the first approach, I would suggest is to find the helpers. And what I mean by that is to find the origins of where the data that you're entering into the different AI tools is coming from, the gold sources and the teams and the organizations at your UC that manage it. Because those are going to be the data stewards. They're going to be the people that understand, hey, if you anonymize this particular, student record, or if you, randomize the grade distribution, is that going to greatly affect putting it into a tool and then an AI tool and then asking it, to infer or to make some, classifications or to give you some answers about it. So find the helpers, find the people who understand the data, the people that know how to wrangle it, go to the gold sources and engage them. I speak from recent experience in that we ran a very large program at UCLA related to OpenAI in the UC system, and got a bunch of ideas from around the campus, 68 plus projects, and people thinking all sorts of different places, from people in the music department, people in the medical school, people that were trying to help sports science. And so a wide gamut of data, and many of the teams that were working with this information and using the OpenAI tools, we encourage them to go find the sources and the origins of the data. Now, if they're the ones that are collecting the data, depending on the different instrumentation, if it's not coming from enterprise and things like that, well, then part of it is to employ these techniques, again, for either ambiguating it, in other words, redacting information, or, changing some elements of it, to ensure that during that collection process, you can still sort of safely feel that you're meeting the merits of the levels that are required to actually put the data into the tool. And understanding about the agreements, like you were talking about, each one of these agreements that we have with these tools do specify at that level of enterprise agreement what the level of data that you can put in, the P1 or the P2 and things like that. So that's, finding the helpers, understanding how the data is collected and curated, and dealing with it. If all of that doesn't work, as Shay was talking about, you could choose a different tool. Instead of using a tool that you have that's, say, not at your particular organization or your system, where you actually have to put the data in, as you talked about, Jenny, in an environment, you're going from a controlled to an uncontrolled environment. Well, change that. Just choose a different tool, or pick something that you can run an LLM, like this Llama, so Llama, things, and there are other alternatives to that. One that you can run locally. And there are versions of that, that can work with your IT organization to potentially set up, where it's not actually sending the tool somewhere to get analyzed, or sorry, the data somewhere to get analyzed and processed. So you can pick a different tool or change the type of tool that you're putting the data into. And then, finally, I would say, and we've been talking about this, besides finding the helpers, potentially picking a different tool. And I talked a little bit about this, but you can modify the data, in various ways. You could potentially aggregate it, removing some of the sensitive information, and still yet having it, having the AI infer things about it. You can, you can anonymize it. You can generate synthetic data. And in a lot of cases, I see people, they're actually having the large language model generate synthetic data that you can actually use to get some generalized, inferences and things that will help you along your actual analysis that you're trying to do, by actually just simply generating synthetic data that, meets the level of the law with respect to the P level that you're using. So find the helpers, pick a different tool, or modify the data in a way that you can still use the tool and get the results. And then, I would be remiss, and I'll hand the mic back to you, Jenny, is, the final answer is, potentially don't use that tool. If you can't get around all of those things, in terms of dealing with it, then just don't use that tool. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I like your advice to find the helpers. I think for all the pieces of that advice, you might need a helper for each step. Do I know how to, anonymize data? Do I know how to synthesize data? What other tools are even out there? If you're not an expert, there are people on every campus who are doing those things. We actually had a faculty member at our webinar last week who was in that boat. She's in humanities. She's not a tech person, and she had this idea for how can I make life easier on my TAs when I'm grading 300 papers. We're all grading these 300 papers. What can I do? And she just started asking questions and found the helpers. And now is creating her own tool. So if you're in the audience and you're thinking to yourself, yeah, I could never do this, you can. There are helpers. They're all over the place. One of those helpers actually is your campus privacy officers. They can help you do some analysis on your data, figure out your P levels, help you de-identify or anonymize. So to that end, Zanab, and I do want to make sure we save time, so we've got about 22 minutes left, but I wanted to get this question to you. You are one of our campus privacy officers for UC Davis. P levels, they seem pretty easy, right? If it's low, it's public. If it's high, it's super sensitive. What if we're kind of like on a borderline case, or you're not sure? Could you give us a little more nuanced advice around the P levels, or maybe sort of walk us through how you've analyzed some of these sort of edge cases in the past that can be a little more tricky?
Yeah, sure. So for my experience, most use cases don't neatly fall into one category. Most of them are the edge cases, which is kind of like weird to say, right? I think given the breadth and sort of the depth of the different happenings at our campuses, it is a nuanced determination where, folks do have to seek out the privacy officer or security officer, combination of both. I work closely with the security team at my campus. And oftentimes, what we'll see are different data types that cross multiple P levels. And so figuring out the data elements and sort of where those land and then combining them all together is sort of the most high level way of describing how it's done. And I know there's a lot of questions that go into that process, and so I think folks on our campus at least know that to expect when they come to us. We're going to ask a lot of questions and dig deeper, but it's ultimately to get to the place that they need to go to move forward and do the next great things they need to do. So, some examples of that, was mentioned earlier, email addresses, UC email addresses. So if we have like name and UC email addresses, those actually do generally fall into the P2 directory level information that's in the UC classification guide. So on the UCOP website, there's a whole IT section with a bunch of the policies, and there's a whole classification standard and guidance documents there. So that's the root of sort of all of this. And anyone can go check those out and review those resources. But the nuance, in addition to that, is if we have students who designate themselves as directory confidential, which is a special designation they can exercise their right under FERPA to do so, that would actually bump their name and email address to become more sensitive, and it would become actually P3 and not P2 anymore. So that's important, because sometimes we'll get folks that say, oh, it's just email address, it's not a big deal. That's directory. We don't have to have consent or anything to share that with anybody. But there are nuances to that if someone has designated, that information to be more sensitive. And then another example, I'll just quickly mention that, we have folks that have data sets that are classified as de-identified data, but it doesn't include their name, but it does include things like demographic information. And so, the reality of that is, depending on, the size of the data set, the exact types of demographic information collected, where the data subjects are located, and any other information that is combined with that, and the method of collection, are all things that would essentially help us determine, well, whether or not it actually could be considered de-identified data under a bunch of different laws. Or if it's de-identified, but there's a higher likelihood of re-identification of the individual, which also under law we have to treat as identifiable data. And so that hits the P3, P4 categories. So it really does get a little complicated, and we do have to get into the nitty-gritty details of the exact data types. And so that's often where I'll start the inquiry.
Great, thank you. So seek the helpers, I think is our takeaway there for sure. Thanks, Enob. I want to make sure that we have time to answer some of the audience questions that are in the Q&A. Please feel free to enter more in. One of the questions that I see, Caroline Adams from UCSB, I think. Hi, Caroline. It seems clear that entering the information in a ChatGPT query is sharing it, but what about using the AI assist in GChat, Mail, Zoom, etc.? Shay, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll take that one. I mean, the answer for ChatGPT is obviously it depends, as if you've got a licensed instance, a licensed subscription that you're working with, then it probably isn't sharing it. And unfortunately, the answer is it depends for the others as well. So at UCSB, I can tell you that starting right now, Gemini is disabled for our environment. That's probably going to change sometime in the near future. When that changes, we'll be using a licensed version of Gemini, and that wouldn't count as sharing it, as it would fall into the same sort of security guidelines associated with email and all the other Google services we've got. So that's one of the challenges with this model, where software as a service products are being rolled out largely indistinguishable, both for a commercial product, for personal use at zero cost, and then with enterprise data protection constraints on them when they're paid for by an organization. And it's not necessarily always obvious where something lands. The it depends answer, you're going to probably hear that a lot as we get into Q&A.
Great, thank you. Any other follow-ups on that? All right. I knew we would get a couple of very technical questions about P-level, so I'm going to throw this one at you. Feel free to say we'll get back to you if you need to, but how large does a P3 data set have to be considered P4, i.e. how many records need to be in it to bump it up to P4? Any takers? Chris?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think, the way I would characterize it is that the size or the volume of the data set is independent of the classification level. It's really, it's not volume that hinges on, it jumping from, P3 to P4. It's the examples and the types of data. So for example, just in the simple delineation that we had up on the screen between P3 and P4, we had things like student grades versus social security numbers, student grades being P3 and, social security numbers being P4. What's the difference there? It's not the volume. It's not that, 1 million social security numbers versus 100 student grades. It's the fact that if student grades were, exfiltrated and ended up in one of these large language models or some other tool, yeah, it would be harmful, but it would be less harmful than if their social security numbers got in there and that, several attackers went on the dark web and then established some identity fraud and things like that. And so that's the delineation. It's not the volume of the data, it's the type of the data related to that. Now, that's not to say that volume doesn't matter, and volume and velocity and variety and all the 5 V's, of big data, they matter related to this. All they do is they exacerbate the problem. We already don't, again, I don't want to get into it on this webinar, but the classification system is great, but then we have to mark and handle our documents and our things with it, and that's not all done yet. And so volume, velocity, variety make that problem more difficult. But the classification levels are independent of the volume V. So.
Great, thank you, Chris. Here's another technical one. In the P1 through P4 chart, it said internal meeting notes. What is the impact of Zoom recording or creating a transcript on meeting? Any takers on that one?
I can try to address that, and if anybody else wants to fill in from the panel. The way I've advised on this and sort of talked about this at my campus is, it depends on what the meeting content is, right? And what type of notes you're taking about that meeting. So it goes to what Chris just mentioned, what type of information is it and what's the sensitivity of that? So for instance, we have a Zoom AI pilot right now, and part of that we have guidance of not to use it for discussions that go into that sensitive territory. So those P3, P4 types of discussions. So ideally, the notes would be about conversations that are really about P1, P2 information. And that's, to the extent that that can be discussed and there are notes or perhaps a transcript or a recording of that that is either intended to be publicly posted, like a broad training for a lot of folks, or it's something that's still internal but non-sensitive and could potentially just be a routine university business record.
Great, thank you. All right, here's another one. Any thoughts about the ability to use AI to learn or derive P3 or P4 data from careful correlation of P1, P2, and non-UC data?
I can jump in on that. There's been a paper I've been wanting to kind of shout out in this call. It's a very, it's an IEEE paper, so don't let that scare you. I know it scares a lot of people. It's like, it's going to be 20 pages of computer science mumbo jumbo. One of the best IEEE papers I've ever read, 6 pages, Big Data's Big Unintended Consequences from 2013. And it lays the foundation of what was coming in today's big data and AI era, which is that no longer were we in the realm of, I create a gift registry for my baby on Target, and it's not aligned with, my Amazon registry and the fact, that my wife is pregnant. We're moving to open loop systems, and things like that now. And they recognize this. They recognize this was coming. It was easy. The opportunity cost was low, and it was going to happen. And so related to this question, Jenny and team, and I invite the other panelists to opine, on it as well, is that today, first off, the difference between some of the classification levels is potentially their combination, of them in a variety of ways. By the way, the same is true of national security data. Something isn't classified until you combine, A and B, and then all of a sudden it's classified. Same applies in certain ways here. So you do need to strictly and strongly consider the ways in which you're combining information. And let me just pick, a specific example. Let's take P1, public research or published research articles. But then let's say that if we combine some of that, information with UC email addresses, which is P2, it's not for public release, but, again, low risk if it's leaked, all of a sudden we have a potentially very valuable data set for employee evaluation, because all of a sudden I've got email addresses or published literature, what they did, and it's potentially sensitive. And I'm not speaking writ large, though, you could certainly say in the comments, oh, this is all, some of this information is public and it isn't. Yeah, but when you combine it in such a way that, it could be used, for potentially sensitive topics, that can become an issue. So the real key is not just to categorize and classify it, but to consider how it could be used, as well, in any of these environments. So thank you. I invite others to comment.
Any other comments?
No, just a really brief add on. I think it's worth thinking about this in terms of not just personal, but also other types of personal information, but other types of business records. So, for example, campus maps are public. UC procurement data is internal, but it can generally be pulled through FOIA requests. However, some of that would start to lead to where network equipment is and what kind of network equipment is installed. And suddenly that's very sensitive information in terms of how we manage our data networks and secure the environment for campus. So absolutely linking different types of stuff together can cause problems.
I think that's actually a really interesting segue on talking about public records, or so much of what we do is a matter of public record when it's requested through the California Public Records Act. One of our questions actually is, would information typically claimed as exempt from the CPRA, California Public Records Act, be considered P4 by default? I don't know if you all have enough familiarity specifically with that law to answer live and on the spot here.
Talk to your campus privacy officer. I think that's a safe, I was going to say, rather than pleading the fifth, talk to your campus privacy officer. I think that's the good one. So
exactly. Find the helper.
And your public records official, right? Each campus has a public records team that processes these things and knows those exemptions very well. So they're also your experts in that space.
Great, thank you. All right. So one of the questions from our audience, even Nico, is asking, is the signal to using a licensed/enterprise product basically that you have to log in with your work login, or is that an oversimplification because companies are rolling out AI features willy-nilly? How do we know when it's controlled or uncontrolled in today's environment?
Yeah, I'll take a start at this. I think that's generally a good starting place. Another good starting place is if your campus logo is embedded on the interface someplace, then someone at your campus has probably configured the environment and it's probably a controlled environment. Those are probably the two easiest, but there are going to be controlled environments where that is not necessarily the case. There will be some uncontrolled environments where they would match those.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. Great point, Shay. And I'll just say that also, this is why it's so important. And there's some discussion throughout the system now of doing an AI inventory of tools and technologies that are at the campus. And in doing such an inventory, part of that is to understand the surface area of AI tools already deployed, but also ones, as noted by the questioner, the audience member, that are just being turned on, and filtering, through that and kind of understanding which ones that we have agreements with, which ones we don't, which vendors are going to our students and saying, oh, please sign up, it's free, which by the way is happening on a number of vendors and things like that. So understanding that surface area is very important.
That's great. Angela Allen is asking that the title of the webinar is Safe Handling of UC Data in Generative AI Applications. And I often work with and have to share data that would be classified as P4 data via Box. She's not exactly thrilled about this. Is there a UC approved AI tool that she can use to share this data safely, an AI tool?
I'll bite on this one first too. I mean, the approval for most of this happens at the campus level, not at the system level, and generally it's going to be some combination of the campus privacy officer and the chief information security officer, or one of his or her delegates, to determine what type of data can be used with which service. So again, this is going to be one where it's best to talk to folks that are local to your campus and understand what the boundaries are for your particular use case.
When we got the ChatGPT and Copilot in UCOP, we put a process in place. If people wants to use P4, they have to submit a form, and the security and privacy will review the use case and what type of data, and then they will either approve and reject. So there is a process in place, and maybe Jenny, I will send you a link to that form, and I think all the security representative, I think I know definitely from OP, but I think also from maybe, I'm not sure, other campuses can also use that, but there is one for OP for sure.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, and bridging that together, Al and Shay, just to add one last comment, the keywords too at your local institution for the tailored process are third-party risk management, or TPRM. And those are the magic keywords, and that'll get those conversations flowing. And so.
Oh, that's great. I think this is a good segue. We have another comment, a question from Shore that says, hi, we're in the initial stages of developing an AI governance framework here at the investment office, and we just started utilizing these tools. Are there any UC specific guidance we can leverage as we work to create this internal committee? I'm just going to plug the work that the UC AI Council has done here in the governance space. You can find tools and guidance from both the council and UC Legal and other partners across the system in creating this. Do any of you on the panel have any specific guidance you might want to point Shore to?
I think there's a lot on that AI website under tools and resources to parse through to give, a starting point, certainly. And I think a lot of this also depends on conversations with, other stakeholders and interested members. So in addition to using those resources, actually, talking to folks that you're working with day to day and who have an interest in, the type of governance structure that you're trying to set up, and including them in that conversation is going to be really important in sort of determining the direction that you're going to go in your own use cases.
Absolutely. I'll note there is a risk assessment guide as part of that as well that might help you, even if you don't use that guide specifically, kind of shape some of the conversations that your governance council might be tasked with having or pushing out to your campus, so they can be very thoughtful and mindful about when to use and engage with different tools. Let's see here. What else do we have? We have time for maybe one more question. So Andrew McCall is asking, what about situations where it appears that something we're doing is winding up in AI, whether or not we're deliberately sending it there? I'm thinking in particular about the new feature in PowerPoint, which uses AI to create alt text. Slightly concerned that my images are being sent to Microsoft without me explicitly choosing to do so, even though it's covered by our contract. So summation there, are there times when we need to be thoughtful or considerate, or do we need to worry that our stuff is going just because we have an enterprise contract, or do we sometimes allow our information to be sent or trained even when we have that enterprise contract?
Yeah. The M365 Copilot has been vetted. It's been reviewed with all the reviewers, like I mentioned, like privacy, security, legal, and then Shorey, who asked a question about IT governance. She was leading that effort. It took us like a year. So I won't be worried much about like whether it's going to be data leakage of your PowerPoint if you're putting the content there. We have all these controls and we have all these agreements and the contracts in place. So it's not much of a worry. It's more worrying about like in using uncontrolled systems like Shay was explaining. Those are more like worrisome than the ones like the licensed one that we have with Microsoft.
Great, thank you, Al. So we have just about 2 minutes left. So I'd like to do just a very quick lightning round. Each of the panelists, maybe 30 seconds. What is the one takeaway that you hope everyone in the audience has here today about safe handling of data? Shay, let's go ahead and start with you.
And the thing I hope everybody takes away is that you're not alone, that you've got resources at your location to help navigate this environment.
Thank you. Al?
Don't be afraid to be using AI tools, be bold, but also use it responsibly. Always also like assume like things might go wrong. So be careful what data you're entering in your input.
Thank you, Al. Zainab, how about you?
So the takeaway I have is responsible data handling practices are all of our obligations, right? And when we learn how to apply them in this context, we can leverage the benefits of AI in a responsible way.
Thank you. Chris, take us home. What's our final piece of advice for today?
Common language, common vocabulary, and don't reinvent the wheel. The UC has done a lot of work on categorizing these data types and thinking about how to use them in tools, and engaging and using that common vocabulary and working and finding the helpers that'll help you help yourself use these AI. And like everyone said, use AI, please, because the worst message is we're telling you don't use AI. We're not saying that. You have to. You're gonna not get away with it soon. So use it, but just like Zainab and others said, use it responsibly.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists. Thanks to everyone who's in the audience today. It was a pleasure to be speaking to you about the safe handling of data and AI tools and systems. I see there are still a few questions in the Q&A. We'll see if we can't get to those and respond to those offline. The PowerPoint with the link to the Berkeley, etc., will be available as well as a recording of this online. Again, that's at ai.universityofcalifornia.edu. We're going to create a webpage there in the next week or so with all of the webinars from this series. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to everyone zooming in, and we will see you next time. Take care.